Hola, hola. Hola, muchas gracias por estar en este miércoles de SOMA. El día de hoy tenemos a Kaucyila Brooke, quien ella es una artista que nos acompaña desde Los Ángeles. Ella aborda las políticas de producción cultural y representación sexual y a través de diversos formatos revaloriza el estatus de la fotografía como objeto. También investiga estrategias de producción de conocimiento e instituciones, estructuras urbanas y la esfera privada. Y sus proyectos están basados en investigaciones de archivo y se centran en la recodificación de géneros fotográficos del retrato, la naturaleza muerta, el reportaje y el documental. Entonces, sin más, yo le doy la bienvenida. Welcome, Kaucyila, and we can start.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for the introduction, Carolina, and also Thomas, thank you for suggesting it. So it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm starting really far back in my trajectory of work. This is, I'm starting in 1980, so that's like 40 years ago. And I think maybe it's something about this stage in my career or this stage in my life or something like that. For the last 10 years, I've been working on my archive, and which you'll kind of see in some of the slides that I show you. But I recently, one of my students interviewed me for an online photography publication called Lens Scratch. And she asked me very basic questions that nobody had asked me before, sort of obvious questions like, when did you begin photographing? And these are the kind of questions that hadn't really come up before. And how did you, start thinking about yourself as a photographer were some of her questions. And I was explaining to her that in the 1970s, I was part of what at that time was called the feminist movement, and then specifically the lesbian feminist movement. And I became aware of feminism partly through working at an anarchist radio station in Columbia, Missouri, which was a listener-supported station, but it had very specific anarchist politics. It was called KOPN FM, and we had what we call block programming, and I was the director of the feminist radio program. So I read the news as a part of the program each week, and the way I constructed the news was from feminist newspapers. And at the time, every major city in the United States that had a feminist community also had a feminist newspaper. And those newspapers had different characteristics depending on the community. So the communities were quite local. For example, Boston was quite known for having a very socialist feminist community. And they had, Denver had a feminist newspaper called Big Mama Rag. Washington, DC, the feminists were very oriented towards sort of mainstream politics in the country, and that newspaper was called Off Our Backs. And Eugene, Oregon had Women's Press. So when I left the Midwest, I moved back to Oregon, which is where I was from. And I specifically moved to Eugene because I knew that there were a lot of collectives there. And I was not only interested in the kind of feminism that I thought women were practicing there from what I'd read in these newspapers, right? But also I knew that there was a history of anarchist collectives in Oregon specifically, and I was interested in exploring that. So the other thing about this time period is that, of course, it was before the internet, it's sort of like, I think that's a funny thing because my father always told a story that when I was a child, he told me that there had been a time before television, And he said he'd never seen such a look of incredulity on anyone's face as when he told me that there'd been a day when there hadn't been television before. So when I say that about the internet, you know, I mean, we know that, but this was a time when hippies and ecologists and people who were living in what were called alternative communities were trying to seize the production of the media. So this KOPN anarchist station that I worked at was doing exactly that. They were a 10,000 watt stereo station, and they were going against all the rules of media, right? To sort of construct and break it down and make a new way of talking about experience and the news. And the same thing was happening with these newspapers. So it wasn't just feminist newspapers. Obviously, the Black Panthers were publishing their own newspapers. There were Latino publications, La Raza, you know, all of the different kind of politicized identity communities were experimenting with the press. And anyway, so I began making photographs. My background was as an English Lit major, and then for a long period of time, I just tried to experience living in these different communal situations. And I started taking photography classes because I wanted to document my community, which I was really interested in. And so my first photographs were published in women's press. So when my former student asked me about how I got started taking photographs, I started talking about women's press. And then I realized actually that I had some very formative moments with women's press. So I started by trying everything. I didn't know what kind of photographer I wanted to be. And I made photographs for the subscription page on the back. And the subscription page, I was setting up these images with friends of mine who would pose. And I was sort of creating a new world, in a sense, a world in which, of course, when people were at a picnic, all they would be doing would be reading women's press, right? And it's a different way of approaching social critique, to sort of not make a fantasy world as much as to take your small, narrow world and turn it into the dominant world, and to photograph it as if it is so. So here's another example. I also was starting to experiment with documentary photography. I didn't know which direction I wanted to go in, but this is Amazon Kung Fu, which was a lesbian Kung Fu collective. And here they're at a political demonstration in Eugene, Oregon. Amazon Kung Fu opposes imperialist wars abroad and colonialism at home. So even something like the name of Amazon Kung Fu is a kind of symptom of the way there was this idea of constructing a different community, or renaming things. This is another subscription page that I made where I found an old bus that I could put my friends in, and that they're all pose as if they're on their way to work, and they're not reading the New York Times, they're reading women's press on the way to work, you know, because obviously it's not a marginal press, it's what everybody's reading. Or instead of playing softball, these women are reading women's press instead of on the playing field, because it's such a compelling journal. So there's kind of humor in it, and there's also orchestrating, getting all my friends together and getting them dressed in certain costumes, giving them props, and you'll see how that continues in the work as it develops. The other thing I found as I was looking through these journals was really telling to me, because of course right now we're talking a lot about issues of diversity, and we're talking about inclusion and exclusion again. And I found this, and Eugene was an interesting experiment in a certain way. That there were so many women in the community who were highly skilled at facilitating meetings, meetings with diverse people who had a lot of different opinions, and they were able to sort of establish an order with an agenda in a way that people would stay on topic, which is, if any of you have ever been part of any organization and had meetings, I'm sure you've had the experience where your colleagues are wildly off topic and seem to just want to hear themselves speak, and they can't follow the agenda, or you don't even know what the agenda is. But this was a very important skill within anarchism, was to how to facilitate a meeting. And in Eugene, people would call a meeting and they would announce it with photocopied flyers on telephone poles, and they would say, community meeting, women's community meeting, and the topic is art and politics. And then if you were interested, you would show up and you would have a conversation. And you didn't belong to anything other than you decided you wanted to be a part of that conversation. I found this announcement as I was looking through women's press. A women's community meeting will be held on Wednesday, April 28th at 7 p.m. in the cafeteria of Lincoln School. The topic of the discussion will be, are all women welcome to women's community activities? The women's community relating to each other. And this I thought was really fascinating in retrospect, because it's so, it doesn't assume anything. And it's willing to take apart its own structure and examine its own structure in some kind of open way, and to talk about, is this really as democratic? Are we really as open as what we say we're open when we call ourselves this thing, the women's community? What does it mean to be women? What is that? Yeah, so I just wanted to show you that, just to show you that this conversation is ongoing. So when I sort of began to professionalize, it was, like many of you, was when I went to get my master's in fine arts. At this point, I had decided on my direction, presumably, that it was going to be fine arts. And of course, I was very influenced by what I was learning at school. I was watching Godard, French New Wave films. Tout va bien was a really important film for me because of the camera work and how it kept looking at the structure, not only of what was being discussed, but also of the filmmaking. And I was still thinking about these experiences that I'd had in Eugene. And so I started making these large wall narratives that were layered. And in this one, this piece is called Money is Time. And it's two parallel narratives, and it's presumably about two lovers, and they had some kind of a disagreement before they went to work that day. And they're trying to talk on the phone throughout the day to sort it out. One works in a collective warehouse, and the other works at a rape crisis center. So they're both working in these kind of alternative ways of working where they have to communicate a lot, but then they're also trying to talk to each other. So these arrows indicate the points where they're having the conversation, and they kind of break through the grid. And the top is a game called a paper plate sailboat race, where you bend a paper plate and you fan the air behind it, and you can't really control where the plates are going to go. And the other narrative with the hands is called Marble Feet, and that's a game where you fill your fingers with marbles and try to hold them so they don't drop them. And both of these games are supposed to be symbolic of the work that goes on in the two women's jobs. One woman works in a warehouse on the top, and so they're kind of moving goods around all day, and the woman below works in the rape crisis center, and so she's trying to balance funding, victims, counselors, meetings. So this is just a detail from the woman who works in the rape crisis center. she says, Connie, can you cover the phone again Friday night? Great. Yeah, she came in Monday. You did a good job with just a second. Set up the meeting, funding committee, accountant, lawyer, get extra chairs. Did you? Yes, I did, and I will. Connie, I'm sorry, I got another call. And back to the warehouse. What about the crackers? No, look, it's peaches that we need for the next order. We need salsa down from Overstock. And you see they've changed the Heister lift into Hysteria because it's a women's warehouse, women's food warehouse. Again, you know, the day is interrupted with this conversation with the lover that can't be finished. I was very interested in camera movements that didn't finish, in conversations that didn't finish, in how these interruptions are maintained and then continued. And again, back to the sort of office work of a social service organization. And I was, here you can kind of see also how I'm kind of setting up. This is another early piece called We Sow, We Reap, We Repeat. And you can see that I have 5 different tableaus set up with my characters. So kind of going back to those early subscription pages from Women's Press. And I was looking at art history tableaus. These are large murals, photographs, black and white mural photographs. And it's actually colored film that's cut and applied to the surface of these. So yeah, there's a very analog, funky quality to all of this, and I was interested in that. There was a lot of talk at the time within art theory about something called the anti-aesthetic. So to kind of expose the structure of the materials that you were using and also to not be incredibly precious and to create a kind of distance between the viewer and the object in that way. And in this case, I was looking at collecting photographs of people who were involved in demonstrations. And I added the captions that were below those photographs to these tableaus that I had been constructing in the studio. And basically I was talking about this kind of repetitive work of demonstrations, of rising up, speaking against something, speaking so-called truth to power, and going back and doing it again. So that's why I said we sow, we reap, we repeat. That the spectacle of the demo is something that won't end and must be repeated, was kind of what I had begun to think about. In 1988, I was still trying to think about these kind of collective processes. And I think one of the reasons why I was so concerned with doing this in my artwork is that when I entered the academy, as in professionalizing myself as an artist, I entered an extremely hierarchical organization, a really sexist organization. My colleagues were very New York oriented, and they were very oriented towards large blue chip gallery careers and museums as being the only kind of credible way of making work. And I really wanted to think about how complex these power balances are between people who are activists on the left, or even who are activists in their own personal relationships. And so I made this very large narrative, and I was, as I mentioned, I was an English lit major, and so I was very invested in narrative. And I wanted to make a narrative that would go around an entire room. And in that early piece I showed you, I used the arrows to break the grid. This time what I used was color coding for the different narratives as a way to be able to formally change what was on top and what was below. So I could kind of weave the narratives together, but you could still follow them with the color of the narrative. And the project is called Not Lying Down. And this was a reference to civil disobedience, when people would lie down and be dragged away, which is a kind of standing up for what you believe in. And also a reference to sex, like lying down to have sex, to lie with somebody is to have sex with somebody, is also a very active kind of engagement. So the title is Not Lying Down. And you can see that there are these arms, these arms that come out from the photographs, and the arms are pulled out of the photographs that are the square photographs in the space. So I think of them as pull quotes from the body of the text. So for example, this, I point to it, this yellow one up here is where the police are, they've got their bully clubs and they're clubbing. One of the demonstrators is the kind of loop of the yellow one that's up at the top, just to show you. So I was also thinking about how meaning is really depending on its context. So in one context, in the photograph, it's abuse. And in another context, once you pull it out, it becomes a linking device from one narrative to the next. So it's a large project. There's 150 some odd Cibachrome photographs on the wall. I was a master Cibachrome printer. This is a process that doesn't exist anymore. And so I was able to use the lab that I designed and printed in to make my work, which is, we always have to find ways to make our work, right? And sometimes it seems as though there's this idea that a day job, the so-called day job, which is what they refer to it as in Hollywood, everybody has a day job. And there's an idea that that's not your real work, but I actually loved my job working in the lab, and it also gave me the advantage that I could make my work. So these are several images from the installation. This centerpiece is kind of the end of the whole narrative. And this is a photograph looking down. I climbed up a ladder and shot down. I didn't have a drone. And this is a group of people having an organizational meeting from an anti-nuke collective. And I put them on these different planes to show that they could still meet in a kind of open circle, even if they had different positions that they were bringing to the meeting, even if they were even split. In one case, somebody's head is split in two. And these are different iterations of the same exhibition that traveled around something that we had in the US at that point, which was artist-run spaces. And we actually had an extensive network of artist-run spaces that were not museums and were not commercial galleries, and they were funded primarily by state funding for the arts. So we had an organization called the National Endowment for the Arts. And I don't know if you recall, but in 1988, actually, that funding was cut because of some US politician named Jesse Helms, who was offended by Robert Mapplethorpe's work. So that basically cut all the funding for this extensive network of these non-for-profit art spaces that really were very important spaces to begin to see work that wasn't necessarily about the commercial venue and hadn't already become collectible by the museums. So there's 4 parts to this narrative. There are these color photographs, and this is a group that is the bylaw committee of the anti-nuke collective. And so they're actually discussing how to be anarchist. And in other words, how to have rules and how to be flexible at the same time, and how to navigate that so that nobody feels as though they're ridden over, right? This is a couple. It's an older white woman and a younger Asian woman, and they're having a discussion about the power dynamics in their relationship and what that has to do with their politics, and if you can bring the two together in a certain way. These are collected photographs from newspapers, from the Tucson newspaper at the time, which is where I was living, of demonstrations around the world. And then I had a group of dancers who came into the studio, and I photographed them in blue, and they mimicked some of the photographs that I found from the newspaper. So in this case, these colleagues are pulling this demonstrator kind of out of the way after being hit with baton or tear gas. In this case, I have these dancers cooperating to lift another person and have to have a conversation about how to balance the weight. And yeah, there's a text that runs through the whole thing. So it was not it's not an easy piece to reduce, and it would take some time to look at. I continued to kind of think about some of those experiences. Of course, I was making lots of other work at the time, and this is kind of the trajectory I want to take you through. This is a project which was called 13 Questions, and it was based, and this is 1990, I think. I know I'm going a little slow, I'll speed up here. 1990, this was based on a series of questionnaires that the roommates and I, living in Eugene, constructed for figuring out how to integrate somebody into the household. So we had 13 questions. And the questions were things like, the one was called the food question, because of course we had to figure out who was a vegan, who was a vegetarian, who could deal with meat being cooked in their house, who wouldn't be able to adapt to that. We had a garden, do you like to garden was another question. So I took those questions and kind of imposed them onto landscapes. This is a parking lot of a big grocery store chain in Southern California, and it's called Ralph's. And in this piece, I have a group of women sitting around a table discussing the food that they're eating. And it's a conversation about food distribution and the importance of that. And this is Are You Messy or Are You Neat? And this takes place, this is also when I was already starting to teach at UC San Diego, so I was in San Diego. And this takes place at San Onofre Power Plant and Beach. So nuclear energy was supposed to be the clean energy. And there's always this idea that a woman's work is never done. It's a kind of classic comment in English. I don't know if it exists in Spanish or French or German. And these women are on the beach and they're raking and they're sweeping, and it's this sort of endless job of sweeping sand, which is absurd, right? So there's a kind of absurdist element to this one, along with the nuclear power and the kind of question about what is clean and what is clean energy and what is clean, really clean. And this is another one of our questions, which was, are you politically correct? And yes, this was one of our questions, because my household, the household I lived in, we were not politically correct, and we certainly didn't want somebody policing us in our own household. So we wanted to bring that up at the very beginning. And what was politically correct at the time were very different things that we discuss now. And lesbian separatism was one of the very important dialogues that were existing in this time period that I was thinking about. And we were not a separatist household, and it was important to kind of figure that out right away. So I have these characters, and they're kind of answering questions to the camera, and their text is below the pictures of them, and as though they're being interviewed. for a news show or something like that. And they are standing in front of a replica of the Unisphere. And the Unisphere is in Queens in New York. And the Unisphere was the symbol of the okay, now I can't remember the World's Fair in New York in 64, 65. And the Unisphere was this sort of attempt to be at the end of nuclear war, the end of the Cold War. And they came up with this symbol where you could see the planets from one side to the other, that it was an open sphere. And the tagline for that World's Fair was peace through understanding. This Unisphere is in Southern California in a place called Laguna Hills, and it's the entrance to a retirement community called Leisure World. So this I thought is very funny, and funny to think about where those politics from 64, 65 had sort of ended up in a later time period. So. Also, you can see I'm also working with this landscape that's a broken landscape. And remember what I was talking about, sort of exposing how things are made. I didn't want to make like a seamless landscape. I wanted to piece it together to sort of show that there were edges, that there's, to emphasize that there's always the square of the photograph, that there's a montage of things disrupting a kind of a seamless view. So jumping forward, this is a project that I started in 1995. And I started realizing in 1995 that the lesbian bar was disappearing. And I realized this because I went to visit a friend in San Francisco, and San Francisco had always been the lesbian town on the West Coast. And the queer town on the West Coast. And there was not a single 7-day-a-week lesbian bar when I went in 1995. And I thought, well, okay, this is an archive that needs to be constructed, and I need to meet the people who used to go to the bars, find out where they had been, and begin to make a photographic archive, and to begin to kind of record information about these meeting places. And the lesbian bar was not, I mean, that's not the capital. It's not where some important papers were signed. It's a vernacular historical place that certainly isn't at the height of any kind of architectural achievement. But these were places that facilitated women creating community, meeting random people, finding lovers, having sex, playing pool, dancing. All things that are something that knit together a community. And in San Francisco at the time, it had become such a bourgeois town and such a bourgeois community that women owned houses, they were getting married, even though it wasn't legal to get married, they were having children, they were having their friends come over their houses. There was no need for a lesbian bar anymore. So I was invited to participate in this exhibition in San Diego that was at the same moment when the Republican National Convention was being held in San Diego. And I decided that this was a point, because I had a little funding, where I could start working on this archival research. And because San Diego is a military town, there was actually 2 7-day-a-week lesbian bars in the town. So this was my starting point. And then in 2000, I was invited to be a part of an exhibition in Vienna called the Steirischer Herbst, which happens in Graz in Austria every year. And the exhibition was was organized by a curator, Stella Rolig, called Female Video as Female Terrain. So she was really actually talking about gendered space. So this seemed very exciting to me to make this work for that. And I made a video installation about these bars in San Diego. On the left side of the installation, I showed the facades of the bars. And on the right side of the installation, I had talking heads, interviews with women who'd been to the bars, describing what they were like. So I bifurcated the facade and the interior. Many of the bars no longer existed as those bars, but also because of safety and because of women's feelings about safety on the street and to avoid harassment, many lesbian bars did not announce themselves to the street. They had coded names. So you wouldn't necessarily associate the facade with what went on inside. I had a third video, was an interview with this woman, Diane Germain, and she talks about the politics of space and the importance of space. And she was very animated, as you can see. And so I put her video, interrupted the two videos on the left and the right, and I projected it from a disco ball motor, and it moved around the room as she was talking about the importance of interrupting space and claiming space, and the politics of women taking up space. At the opening, I realized that people weren't going to come anywhere but where the drinks were. And I thought, well, I've got a bar, so let's serve in my bar. So actually, this is just a kind of badge snapshot showing you that it actually functioned as a bar that one night of the opening. And that was the only time I was able to realize the project as a video installation. Later, I had the opportunity to do this work again, but this time I showed it in Ulm, in the Stadthaus, Ulm, Germany. And the Stadthaus Ulm is designed by Richard Meyer, famous Richard Meyer. And he has a lot of rules about how the art can be shown there. And one is you cannot block the windows. So no video installation. Another rule is you cannot put holes in the wall. So all the work had to be framed and hang from a hanging rail. So I sort of soon discovered that if you address the politics of space, you will also encounter the politics of space. And even if it's just with the architect who wants to be the artist in the space at all moments, right? So here, even his railings, I couldn't get a decent installation shot without these Richard Meyer railings in front of everything. Which I think is kind of funny. But anyway, so I had wanted to make a series of large-scale photographs of these bars to kind of elevate them, although they are vernacular architecture, and although they are not designed to be lesbian bars. I wanted them to be big and beautiful and seductive. And I photographed them in the day because they're an archive, and many of these bars were only attended at night, obviously. And maybe the people that went there were drunk and they don't remember how they got there, and they don't remember exactly where they were. So I felt like the archive should be during the day for the most part. And I took the video installation and turned it into a single channel with a split screen, so I could still, make a difference between the interior and the exterior. So in this case, it becomes more contextual than the main piece. These are some of the early images from San Diego. This is the Flame. And the Flame was really a remarkable bar and very fancy. And many of the women that went to this bar had never been to a lesbian bar that was not a dive before. It had 3 rooms. It had a long bar with roll and tuck kind of wall, like leather wall behind it. It used to be a steakhouse, so it still had a lot of the furnishings from the steakhouse. It had a big room with a pool table. It actually had a folk cafe, and it had a dance floor. And the opening, according to one of the women that I interviewed for the video that I made, she said the opening was huge. People arrived in limos and tuxes, and they never thought this was possible. It's such a beautiful building. I think, unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. It's been torn down, but so it's called the Flame because it was a steakhouse. But the flame then becomes like a lover, or the flame of love. This was another bar that was existing in San Diego at the time, Club Bombay. This was a much more working class bar, and it was a much more, it was a wider bar. The Flame was very good about having salsa night and soul night to make sure that women of color felt like they had their own space and their own time in the bar. Bombay was not so conscious like that. It was kind of like the sports bar. Bombay later became 6 Degrees, but was still a lesbian bar. So the titling of these images has to do with, if it is a lesbian bar, the title of the image is 6 Degrees. In this case, this is called the Casbah, and then in quotes, formerly the club, so you know that it's no longer a lesbian bar. This is called X, which was the name of this club, and it was formerly Lily's. But I thought that was hilarious that it used to be called Lily's, and now it's such a hardcore kind of punk club. And I always thought it was really interesting. This is from a show at Platform Berlin, which is a space right near the Volksbrunner, sort of in Berlin and Berlin Mitte. And at night when the lights were turned on, it was like such a California scene with these like big puffy clouds, and so completely different than Berlin. And at that time that I showed this work, I actually produced a series of postcards, because I thought, when you monumentalize something by making a big print, you know, that says it's important, but it's also important if it's a postcard, which is seems like it's minimalizing it. But if you send a postcard and say, oh my God, I finally went to the world famous Flame, here's a postcard of it, it must be really important. So I made this postcard set. In Los Angeles, I found that it was so hard to get around the city. Even though I lived there, I would get to a site to photograph it, and the light would be wrong because I would have been stuck in traffic. So I'd show up with my 4x5 camera to make this, you know, truly beautiful photograph. The roads were so wide that I couldn't really get the sort of image that I wanted without getting killed by the traffic whizzing by. So I was having a lot of difficulty photographing it. So I decided to limit the number of large scale images that I made. I made this one on the left, which was a club that had been red tagged during the earthquake. In other words, it was an empty lot and had been torn down because of an earthquake. And this other bar was the Oxwood Inn, and the Oxwood Inn actually had survived for 35 years with the same owner. So I kind of made this opposition between full and active and empty and disappeared. And then I made a large-scale chalkboard map with small snapshots and anecdotal material on the map, sort of describing what people told me about those spaces and what my experience was going to the spaces. It's not an actual map of Los Angeles. You know, I sort of broke it up so that, you know, Boyle Heights is over on the left, a small little area. The beach is over here, and then sort of West Hollywood and North Hollywood is in the middle. And I had codes, so the ones that were surrounded with pink were still functional bars when I was working on the project. And so then the photographs became more descriptive, I would say, than monumental in this case. And I was interested in this chalkboard because I thought, you know, history in Los Angeles changes so rapidly. People who've lived in Los Angeles have this uncanny experience of driving down a road and suddenly going, wait a minute, there was a building there just yesterday, right? What happened? So there isn't this kind of sense of urban preservation in Los Angeles in a kind of large public way. And it changes quite quickly. So I thought maybe the erasability of memory was something that would function well with these chalkboard anecdotes. And also anecdotal histories became very interesting for me to think about along with vernacular architecture, that history is not just what's written by the masters of history. It's not just written about wars. It's also what people experienced, right? So here, I'll read you this one. Moon Shadow. The guys at Fuel told me about a lesbian bar on Burbank. They said, go past Rawhide and then Jocks on the left and see Bullet on the right, and it would be immediately on the left. When I walked up the door, it was all men standing around. They said that it was absolutely a women's bar. They were there for the pool league. Inside, we met the owners. Christy thought the bartender was cute. So, I mean, men's bars in general really announce themselves on the street. Jocks, Bullet, Rawhide, the Meat Market, you know, these are bars that and this lesbian bar that was in North Hollywood, which is called Moon Shadow, right? Much more kind of romantic idea. And inside there were lavender lights and fairies hanging above the bar. And so a much kind of softer kind of idea about what was going on in that bar. So as I showed this Los Angeles part of the Boy Mechanic and redid the map in various places, of course it changed because of the size of the wall, it changed because of the surface of the wall, and it changed as the bars were changing. And this is from an exhibition space in Leipzig. And it's a really incredible exhibition space called the Center for, oh, now I can't think of the name of it. Gestalt and Kunst, no, that's not it. Never mind, it'll come back to me. Anyway, what is it? That's it, the Center for Contemporary Art, but suddenly I can't say it in German, I don't know. So, what is it? Thank you. Zeitgenössische Kunst. So all of these walls in this space move on these diagonals, so that it's quite a challenge for the curators. It was nice for the architects. Sorry, I know that I have an architect here, so I don't mean to keep slamming architects, but it was nice for the architects in a beautiful exhibition space, right? But there was no square walls, and to sort of figure out how to make things work in these movable walls was always a challenge for the curators that worked in the space. And this was an exhibition that was about gender and space. It was quite interesting. So I had this wall that faced out on the other side of the glass. So it was always lit at night. And I had that, again, that really uncanny experience of seeing a map of Los Angeles in Leipzig at night, kind of glowing. And in this exhibition, I was able to bring together San Diego and Los Angeles in a different configuration. And there's the Los Angeles video is projected on that back wall, and it continued around and showed the images that I already showed you of San Diego. In Cologne, Germany, I was invited to participate in the first museum queer show that was in Germany at the Museum Ludwig. And they commissioned me to do a part of the Boy Mechanic in Germany. And so I decided that I wanted to make a poster, and it's a two-sided poster. So on the front is again, the facade, and on the back are these anecdotal conversations about the spaces in German and in English. And at the center the larger photographs were 3 7-day-a-week lesbian bars in that town. So that was really a record. And I had such a different experience interacting with the community and also interacting with the building owners in these different towns. It was very open. It was very different than anything I've experienced in any American cities. I've been on the West Coast. And this is the installation where, again, I'm bringing together a portion of the Los Angeles map and then the poster for the Cologne series. And then here's an example of how it's changed. Christy thought the bartender was hot, but later she met her at another bar and changed her mind. And this was also something I learned in the meantime. Lily is a neon artist, so she knew these kinds of things. Lily told me that the size of the cocktail sign is regulated by the city, and the neon has to be connected in such a way that if the tubes burn out, cock will not be illuminated alone. Which for me was such a revelation, because you think you notice these things in the city and then you find out, oh no, you didn't just notice it, it's already designed, it's already thought through, you know. I think they also didn't want tail to be illuminated alone. These are the 3 bars in Cologne that were operating when I was there doing research. This was a kind of this was a dance bar, very hip. This was during Carnival. And Cologne has the largest carnival in all of Germany. And this was Besser Bar, so that means it's the better bar, and it was down by the university. And this bar actually had a website. So, I mean, in San Diego, I couldn't photograph inside of the bars because the military lesbians didn't want anybody to know that they were lesbians, because they could have been thrown out of the military. At that point, the US military had a don't ask, don't tell policy. So this was very closeted, very secret. And one of the other things that I discovered in a lot of my research in the different cities is that there was a lot of complaint about the bars. Cocktails were too expensive. It was too much of a dive. There weren't enough tables and chairs. There were too many tables and chairs. There weren't enough stalls in the bathrooms. You know, the music wasn't right. So there was a lot of complaints, and in the women in Cologne I talked to, same thing, right? And so I thought it was hilarious that the university women just called their bar the better bar. I won't read this, basically this text says that about the better bar. This bar was kind of the older women's bar, kind of the sort of 70s, 80s lesbian bar. It was called the Tides. So that's kind of like this flow femininity kind of idea. It was what they call Kneipe, which is a corner place. So they actually served things like lentil soup and heavy brown bread. You can see it has a rainbow flag on its sign. And this is very different, because you recall that I said these bars don't announce themselves to the street, but that's not the case in Cologne, right? And I also started this project thinking, well, these are spaces that are never going to have one of these plaques that the city puts up that says, oh, Diego Rivera lived here, or, you know, George Washington slept here, and there's a brass plaque, or, but this one had a brass plaque. And it says it's the site of the first lesbian kind of marching corps, which is called Maria Loach, and it's part of one of the regular clubs in Carnival, which is, you know, big part of the city organization. So it's very interesting, you know, my limited ideas really got challenged in doing this project. San Francisco, these 2 bars, they they had these one-way signs, which was pretty interesting because the Elbow Room used to be a bar called Amelia's, and it was a big dance hall, and it closed, and there was about a 7-year period in between in which there was no lesbian bar until the Lexington Club opened up. So they kind of bookend that time period when I started the project and there was no lesbian bars. And because San Francisco has such a self-conscious queer community, I actually could go to the public library and there was a list of all of the historically owned queer businesses, right? So I went back to the 40s and found this bar, which was now is a strip club called the Garden of Eden, but had been a bar called Tommy's Place. And in the 30s and the 40s, actually, when the Midwesterners would come to San Francisco, there were these tours that would take them around where all the queer clubs were, where the men dressed like women and the women dressed like men. And that was kind of what these how these tours would advertise themselves. And that's also documentation for what some of the addresses were. And because I had so many historic names for the bars, I was able to make these series of drawings with just the names of the bars. So this one is the kind of sexy bar titles. I kind of collected them into these lists. So this one's called, these are, I don't know if you can read those. 1001 Nights, A Little More, Alley Cats, Anxious Asp, Beaded Bag, Cherry Bar, Chi Chi Club, Desire, Ecstasy Lounge, Flow, Girl Do Me, Heart's Delight, Hush Hush Lounge, La Cave, Saturnella, Talk of the Town, Who Cares, and Wild Side West. Okay, so I'm going to shift. The American writer Kathy Acker died in 1997, and I had the opportunity to photograph her clothes. And you saw in a lot of the setup images that I did that was involved in kind of a theatrical presentation of the characters and their costumes and animating these narratives that I'm telling. And Kathy Acker's writings are very involved in what I call persona play. So the characters sort of shift their desires throughout the course of the narrative. It's sometimes very difficult to keep track of them because they change what they want, they change how they behave, sometimes they change their names. And I found this really engaging, and it reminded me of my early days back in Eugene, where we were constantly changing our names and changing our styles and our narratives. And so you can see she also had this amazing collection of 80s fashion clothes, as well as motorcycle riding costumes and lingerie and very butch clothes, very little girly clothes, very tough clothes. So I photographed 154 of these clothes hanging on a hanger. It's not an actual wire hanger, but it looks kind of like a classic wire hanger against a white background. So they kind of float. And these are some of those images, which I sort of styled in a way so they seemed like characters. And so that her writing is very sexualized, it's very aggressively sexual. So I did that also with the clothes to emphasize those aspects. I mean, they were her clothes, so she certainly selected them because of their erotic qualities as well. So the series is called Kathy Acker's Clothes. And this is Vivienne Westwood, they're Calvin Klein, they're Yamamoto, and Betsy Johnson. So a lot of the sort of punk designers from that time period. Gautier, with the sort of Hell's Angel insignia, sort of there's a ton of little black dresses in the collection. This is Betsy Johnson. This looks like, you know, a little church girl or something, or a communion dress, but a little sexier maybe. Then this kind of, these cutout concept jackets from Gautier. So it became more like a sculptural project for me than a fashion project. At the time was not very familiar with most of these designers. So they were just shapes for me to organize. So they're stuffed with quilting stuffing, and they're suspended from monofilament or fishing wire, and to animate them. This is Vivienne Westwood. This is apparently one of the most famous pieces that Vivienne Westwood made, which is these tights with the mirrored fig leaf right at the level of the crotch. So she was quite playful in her writing, but also in her persona. And she didn't really make a separation between how she was in life and how she was as an artist and a writer. This one, I can almost not imagine what it would look like on, actually. It's such an amazing winged kind of classic profile. And this is an example of an installation of quite a few of them. And it sort of becomes like an archive when it's in a grid like this. I've sometimes put them in a line in different groupings. So these are images from 2012 from a solo survey exhibition that I had at the Badischer Kunstverein in Karlsruhe, Germany. And this was not a complete retrospective. It was a survey show, and it focused on my narrative works, which is what I've been talking about a lot tonight. And at the beginning of this conversation that I was having with the curator, she was encouraging me to make work that had to do with Karlsruhe. But of course, I didn't know anything about Karlsruhe. And she said, well, let me take you to the town archive. You like archives, don't you? And I was like, well, yeah, who doesn't like an archive? We went to the archive. Of course, I don't speak German. And the archivist was like, well, I don't know, what do you want to see? And of course, I couldn't send him any direction. And he pulled this document out, which was the marriage document between Gustav of Sweden and one of the Habsburgs. And, you know, there were a lot of Habsburgs to marry off, you know, so this was actually, I don't know why it was in the Baden-Baden, I mean, in the Karlsruhe archive, but anyway, here it was. And it was a remarkable document with this giant seal. So this brass container at the bottom holds a seal that's this big around. And I thought, that's fantastic to have a seal like that. So this was a starting point for me. And also I was really fascinated with this document because it was, you know, Kaiser so-and-so with all of his power decrees this and that and gives you this and that land. This is the seal. Completely, it's not like a little ring seal or something like that. there's the double-headed eagle and the crown on top, and it even has its own brass case, which I thought was pretty cool. So I kept thinking about that. Meanwhile, this archive thing really started making me think about my own archive. And I had saved things, but every time I thought about actually opening the drawers, I started feeling like throwing up because I just didn't even know how to approach it, right? And so I met some archivists who were getting their PhD at the University of California, and they were interested in working on my archive. So they came into the studio and they started, you know, making me nauseous, pulling things out, and I say, oh, we could just throw that away. No, that they identified things with locator numbers, and they made an Excel sheet, and they did all these things that I was terrified of. But that was really interesting to me because since this was a survey show, I thought, well, maybe it's interesting to integrate some of my working materials into the survey show. So this is a page of dialogue balloons from a project. When I draw them out before I scan them or photograph them on the way to montaging them into my projects. This is an early project, and this is a maquette, almost like a sculpture maquette for that. So we're looking at everything. And I had also started archiving my work by diagramming my work. People were constantly asking me, how could I have such a diverse practice? Why the work didn't look like each other? Why it wasn't stylistically similar? And so I was thinking about that, and I said to myself, what do they want? They want me to draw them a diagram. And so I thought, okay, fine, I'll draw some diagrams to make clear what the connections are. So this series of drawings is called Do You Want Me to Draw You a Diagram? And this one's a kind of map of the titles of various projects, and the colored lines that go around them are the codes. And it has codes, of course, every map has a code, but of course, nobody has the patience to try and figure it out. So I don't think I clarified anything for anybody. It makes sense to me, and I've given you the codes, but you know, whether you have the patience, I don't know. And I designed my own seal because I thought, of course you need a seal because you need to be able to say, I authenticate this exhibition. So at the entrance to the exhibition, we projected the seal. And the exhibition was called Do You Want Me to Draw You a Diagram? And this is moving into the exhibition hall from where the seal is projected. Oh, sorry. And this is an ongoing project called Tit for Twat, which is about Madam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So it's a different creation story than what we usually read in all of those printed Bibles. Again, if you think about those early women's presses where we were kind of making up our own journalism, I'm also going back and rewriting certain mythologies. And the first section of this is Madam and Eve in the garden, and this is where the characters are introduced. That's Madam on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side of the orange tree, which is the tree in this particular garden of significance, is Eve. And the narrators of the story are the talk show hosts, journalists, basically. And here's some installation pictures from this show in 2012. This is the document that I wrote about Madam and Eve and the seal, the giant seal. And this says it is with no special authority and without making a command. We desire and encourage our beloved characters, Madam and Eve, to follow the narrative to its multiple points of origin. So that's the left-hand page, and then the right-hand page has more instructions about the kinds of legacies that is given to all of you because of Madam and Eve and their existence, including the right to have a relaxed California lifestyle. So you all have that because of Madam and Eve now. There's the seal. And you can see in this large hall these vitrines, and the vitrines were working materials from Tit for Twat. And they're kind of positioned in relationship to some of the panels that were on the wall so that you could see preparatory materials and sketches. And the archivist designed these vitrines and made the list of materials and kind of figured out the layout as if they were doing it in a library. So that was important. And I also showed some other examples of earlier narratives. This is a narrative which is called Unknown Deviancies, What a Dish. And the pleasurable thing about doing a survey show is suddenly you can see correspondences in your own work that you didn't know existed. So on the right is the first panel of Unknown Deviancies, What a Dish, and that's a picture of me in a unitard. And you see in the far room, the middle image, which is from Kathy Acker's clothes, is also a unitard, and I've styled it, of course, in a similar position. So these kind of unconscious things are something that until I look back at my own work, I can't see the correspondences. And that was the privilege of being able to see all the work brought together. And the last room in the exhibition showed this early piece from 13 Questions, and then a number of vitrines of working materials from other projects that we were not including in the exhibition, and some other narrative pieces, drawings, and then in the end, working materials for, again, these early pieces that I was showing you. And then the drawings which are the diagrams of my own works from the series, Do You Want Me to Draw You a Diagram? And here's the map that I showed you earlier. This is a timeline of the works and when they were created. This is a drawing about works that have to do with the politics of space. So it's like a Baroque garden with parterres coming out from the folly in the garden. And these are works that have to do with costume and performance and performativity. Oops. Yeah, and this is works that fed out of Tit for Twat, because Tit for Twat really is a generative piece. So that's why I show it as a kind of seed. And again, back to this DIY kind of conversation that I was having at the beginning about just deciding that you're going to make a newspaper. I obviously cannot draw, right? But that hasn't stopped me from drawing. So I think that, you can see that in these, but in a way, I'm working out the ideas and making the connections that I need to, which is what these newspapers were also doing. So there you go. I leave the seal to say I authenticate this conversation. Thank you all for your attention. Yeah. Good. Ask them all. Yeah, I think you can see it even in the frames, right? Like those big black frames. I mean, that's something that really becomes, as things become more aestheticized in museums and things like that, the frames become like more important. Whereas like that early work, they're not framed, they're just push pinned on the wall. That was definitely part of financial decision, but also the aesthetics of the time. And also art, there's sort of art influences in terms of what was changing, but there's also technology changes, right? So in the early pieces, there was no Photoshop. And so I would construct them by there, but there were photocopy machines and you could enlarge and reduce, right? So I would go to the photocopy machine and reduce my photographs and enlarge them and cut them all out and try them at different sizes. And that's how I would kind of construct the narrative panels. Whereas later I could do it in Photoshop to see what it looked like, then go back and print them exactly the right size. So everything is cut and pasted together. It's not a digital image. And that's something that I resisted, the digital, for a long time. So in some ways you could say I'm kind of technophobic, even though I work with technical materials, right? I was so inspired by the work of the Berlin Dada group, Hannah Hosch or John Hartfield, and I loved looking at the edges of the cut paper, and so I wanted to continue to work that way. Yeah, also there, and yeah, and just being able to do a drawing and stick it there on top of the photograph. I mean, I had people say to me, you make such a beautiful photograph and then you ruin it. You stick this dialogue balloon on top, you know? Yeah. Well, I haven't shown with her. That would be amazing. But yeah, that I have shown a lot in German-speaking Europe, Switzerland, Germany, and also Austria, and the United States. Some other places as well, but I found a like-minded community of artists in German-speaking Europe, artists who wanted to think about layers of meaning and text and history. Yeah, but I don't know if I answered your question about the art world changing. Well, I think you remember that quote I showed you at the very beginning about are all women invited to women's community meetings? I mean, I think that there is a problem in identity politics in general that existed then and exists now. that identity politics can make an exclusion also. It can provide support, and it can provide a place to actually talk about your own issues together, right? But it can also leave people out who might benefit from that conversation, right? So I think that that's a constant struggle. And I think, I mean, in the early period that I was talking about, there were very few trans women and trans men. And there were some early trans women who got involved in feminist politics, and that sort of was a big explosion in the discourse, which was good, actually, you know, because once the sort of historical part of, okay, what does it mean historically to be a woman, and why haven't I been allowed to do this or that, and why was I only supposed to be, you know, in this one part of society, you know, when we want to break through that. There's that, but then there's also a holding too tight to that identity, so that there was an early sound engineer who was a trans woman who became a member of the Olivia Records collective. I don't know if you know Olivia Records. It was a company out of San Francisco that produced feminist records. And they went on to have cruise ships, but that's another story. But this early trans woman was a great sound engineer. And so they went, well, okay, it's a women's label and you identify as a woman. They brought her on. And then of course there was a big boycott by these separatists that you're talking about, who had a very essentialist idea about what femininity was and what gender was. So yeah, I think now it's really a different discourse. Mm-hmm. But we were talking about that the other day, actually, or maybe it was lunch, at lunch today. You know, one of the things that was really important in that early feminist movement was this movement about understanding your body. And women got together and did self-examinations, and they studied their health and their body. And they tried to understand what their sexuality was. Rather than received information, they started to try and figure out what their pleasure was, what was their desire. And it was very self-generated. It wasn't anything that our parents taught us, right? And it wasn't anything that we learned at school. And we didn't have this expectation that we could create our own history just by what was received information. So I think that was very empowering. And yeah, and I also saw that, I mean, another community that I know has really been involved in that is the sadomasochist community, because the SM community has always had educationals. They always educate each other about, you know, what pleasure is, what their desire might be, how to negotiate a relationship. So maybe that's something also that's missing from the sort of distraction of not being able to mobilize politically. It's great. Great questions. Thank you.
We do have a question from YouTube. Gerardo Rojas, that is watching you. He says, hi,
I didn't realize that was part of the function of the YouTube.
Yeah.
Wow.
YouTube channel.
Cool.
So Gerardo Rojas says, hi, Soma, I have a question to Kaucyila. Did you ever include Native American women in your art practices? If you did, where can I look at for those pieces? Thank you.
No, I have not, actually. tit for twat is one white woman and one African American woman. I can't think of a project that I had a Native American woman. There is an Asian woman as part of the couple, but I didn't organize the talk around those ideas so much. But it's, I also, it's important not to speak for somebody else and somebody else's experience. So I think I'm cautious also, but there's a lot of stories to be told there. Yeah. Thanks.
I don't know if you can tell us more about your exhibition here in Mexico City.
Yes. So good cue. Yeah, I have some work up in an exhibition here in Mexico City that's organized by my friend Nadia, who's here, and and the work is very different than anything I've showed you here. And the work is something that I started making in 2012, and it is a project that is influenced by an Italian painter from the 1950s, Giorgio Morandi. Giorgio Morandi painted his collection of ceramic vases in his studio for most of his career. And he lived in Bologna and he taught at the university there. He hardly left Bologna and he hardly left his studio. So he wasn't, he had a very well-known career at the time, but not because of self-promotion or traveling. And this was a revelation to me to learn about his work because I collect ceramics, not precious ceramics, ones I like the shapes of. And I arrange them and kind of rearrange them in my home, but I never thought of making work out of it. And then seeing his work at the Metropolitan Museum in New York made me think I could, well, maybe there's something, maybe this would be fun because I'm kind of already doing that. And then my father died in 2011. And after that point, I decided I was going to make a series of photographs of these vases against a white background. And so the series is entitled After Morandi and After GLH, and that was my dad's initials. And they're on exhibit at Lo Sublima, is that right? Oh, you can speak on the microphone.
Come on, Nadia. Ok, se llama Lo Sublime, de Al Ratito Estudio, cuya curadora está aquí presente y todavía estamos abiertos fines de semana, viernes y sábado, y entre semana por cita previa, y estamos en Córdoba 225 en Roma Norte, por si gustan pasarse y ver el trabajo de Kaucyila, que es increíble. Y ya. ¿Algo más, Nadia?
No.
Estamos como Al Ratito Estudio. Al Ratito Estudio. ¿Sí? Ah, no.
Yes.
Thanks for the talk, Kaucyila. I was really glad that, gladly surprised at the beginning of your conversation, you pointed out a very important link, theoretically or conceptually speaking, for your work between feminism and anarchism. And picking up a bit on the questions that you already had, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that relationship and if anything has changed from 40 plus years to today in how you conceptualize the relationship between anarchism and feminism.
Well, I'm sure a lot has changed. I mean, I don't live in an anarchist community anymore. The economy has really changed. So it's at a certain point, I realized that I couldn't live marginally anymore. So, I mean, at that time, actually, when I was living in that community, Jimmy Carter was president in the United States, and we had very liberal social funding. And the economy was very low. So, I mean, I actually lived in a converted chicken shack, and with stolen building goods from building sites. And the person who built the building was getting a degree in carpentry that was paid for by the government because the government was funding non-traditional labor education. So all of those things went away with Ronald Reagan. So the possibility of the existence of this alternative community really changed. And then people kind of, it's like I professionalized for the first time. So for the first time, I thought I took out a loan to go to school because we don't have free education in the United States. And I was in debt for the first time, right? And that completely changed my relationship to money, right? So I think the other thing that for me personally was very different was entering the art world, which is a very moneyed hierarchy. And the money to produce exhibitions and the kind of money that attaches itself to brand names. And there is not a lot of room for breaking that apart. In fact, it just seems as though it's getting more and more solidified, that there's bigger and bigger players, and the smaller players have a harder time actually continuing to make out their space. This is not exactly answering your question, but the place where I'm able to continue to practice anarchist feminism is in the classroom. So it's a smaller pond, but at least it's my pond. And I teach a class called Queer Crit Potluck. And in that class, the students take turns preparing meals for each other. And they take turns sort of learning how to cooperate with each other to make a meal. And we sit and we have a meal together, and then we critique their work. But by the point that they're critiquing each other's work, they've already become a community. And so it's more of a conversation from the inside than it is a conversation attacking somebody's position from the outside. So I think that's the place where I can continue to break down these hierarchies and break down these uncooperative relationships. But in terms of sort of generally being involved in a sort of anarchist, I mean, my school, which is more experimental than most schools, it's CalArts. It started in 1968. So it kind of started with these more liberal ideas about what you teach in an art school. But we are becoming more corporate. Yeah.
Actually, maybe you already
Now I do, yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's a really good question because, and I didn't sort of break it down in that way. That would be a different lecture, but I could also make that lecture because the work becomes more, and maybe this is also back to your question, I started experimenting with single images, kind of classic single images. So I started working through genres. I did a series of portraits of people wearing shower caps. And this is the work, maybe back to the Native American question, where I photographed colleagues, friends of colleagues who were all different identity categories, wearing shower caps smashed into different shapes that they felt like represented them somehow. I was thinking of historic portraits where people's identity was tied to their employment, and their hats symbolized their employments. But those are, single portraits in a line on the wall, and maybe it's like Kathy Acker's clothes also. Those are single images, spare, clean, but there's 154 of them, right? So I think also in the multiplicity, in the insistence on multiple images, even if it's a group of single images, I'm still resisting a kind of singular worldview, although it's a little cleaner, you know. Tit for twat, still kind of messy, kind of more like the earlier work a little bit, but yeah, I think it is way more isolating living in a place like Los Angeles. I'm not in that puppy pile anymore. Do you know what I mean? When I was younger, we laid around on top of each other. You know, we lived in these communal houses. We were boundaries were really slippery between all of us. It was like the way puppies are, you know. And yeah, professionalizing means much more separate kind of relationships, more individual kind of autonomy. And I try not to be nostalgic for that, right? Because I think many people as they age think that when they were in their 20s was the best time. And they continue to listen to the same kind of music, same hairstyle, same fashion from that time period. And I have the privilege of working with so many beautiful young people that messes with that all the time. You know, I have to keep up. And I can't make those disparaging comments like, oh, the young people today, because they are my contemporaries, you know? So I think at Cal Arts, that saves me from that kind of boring, professional, you know, suburban, separate, meaningless life in a way, you know? And it's interesting because I've been thinking about that in relationship to retirement, you know, because many of my colleagues are like, oh, I can't do this anymore. I want to retire. And this is so hard teaching all the time. And, you know, the institution is such shit. You know, we want to, you know, I just don't want to do that anymore. And I think, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't stay up to date. You know, I wouldn't know what music people are listening to, and I wouldn't know what the current fashion was. I mean, other than what was in the media, you know, but that's not really interrupting the way I think about things in the way that working with young people is. It's a little bit of a vampire relationship with students, I think, sometimes, you know. I give, but I take a lot too. Yeah. That's fantastic. I'm happy to hear that. And I saw that a lot in the movement after the financial fall that was really in big cities. Why can't I think of the name of it? What is it? Thank you. During the Occupy movement, because a lot of those actions were organized anarchistically. And I think anarchism is especially functional for small groups and for small group management. And I don't know that I mean, once you're talking about government, things like that, I'm not sure what the solution is for any of that, but I think it can be quite functional as a way to bring people together to make an agreement about what direction they want to go and how they want to do it. If they are educated about and make an agreement about how to balance that power. Great. Yeah. The what? Yes. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that humor is something that also kind of is kind of related to pop culture and is kind of dismissible, right? I mean, the famous feminist quote about humor is the Hélène Cixous idea about in her text about the laugh of the Medusa, where she talks about how laughing is actually, a sort of a direct castration of the phallus and a phallocratic power, at women's laughter in particular. And I think that within the kind of face of the monolithic culture, right, that takes itself very seriously and takes its power very seriously, to insist on play is a way to not go to war, but to enjoy pleasure, life, I mean, it's sort of like, I guess the other big quote would be Emma Goldman, if I can't dance, I don't want to be in your revolution, right? And I think that it is funny, and there is a lot of things that we can make fun of and play with, and it's a way to encounter the plasticity of culture and of a medium, in a sense. And it's very funny also, I think, that artists, when they talk about their art work, it's always called work. And when artists take themselves very seriously and they say, oh, I can't come talk, I have to work. And this I have to work thing seems to be kind of like a badge of importance, right? And I don't think that that kind of anxiety is any more attractive in an artist than it is in somebody who goes and works in a bank. I think that play is such an important, and pleasure is so important in making your work, and the time you spend in the studio and the time you spend talking about it and devote to it, So that's also these cartoons with the women talking to each other. I mean, it's not right, it's not serious enough. It's not slick enough somehow. It's to fit into the serious art world, right? And that is an act of resistance for me. And it's a kind of refusal also. I think that's exactly what you're bringing up on. And the interruption, I mean, I mean, back to Berlin Dada, I mean, they were ridiculous. And all the Dadaists were ridiculous. And they were so alienated from what had gone on in World War I and the mechanization of the body and the mechanization of those conflicts. And, you know, this is existentialism, right? And this is like the absurdity of all of this. And, you know, I think that work is so inspired. Sometimes you can't understand it, you know, and that's also kind of tricky. Like if you look at Hannah Hosch's work and you see this baby with Karl Marx's head on it, you know, or you see Marlene Dietrich's legs on a pedestal, and you can't say, or the ethnographic museum stuff, right? And you kind of go, oh, I can't explain that, you know, but I think that that's also the power of it, is that you can't come away and go, yeah, that's right. That's politically correct. I agree with that. I know that's okay. You know, you have to keep dealing with that gap, you know, and thinking about it. It's disturbing. It interrupts it. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks everybody for coming. I don't want to keep you any longer. I think the bar is open. Is that right? Thanks so much.